What's up, YouTube? This is Too Raw for TV. All right, so I got a request from a subscriber to do a video on who I think was the better player, Yao Ming or Chris Bosh. All right, so Yao Ming played, I believe, about 8 years in the NBA. The last 2 years, I think, or a year and a half, he dealt with injuries. In particular, injuries to his feet, which caused him to retire. As far as Chris Bosh, I believe he played something around 12 years or so in the NBA. And he retired due to health issues dealing with, if I recall correctly, blood clots. I believe he was only in his mid-30s, 31, 32, when he retired. And I'm going to tell you something about my feelings about Chris Bosh. I think he was a very good player, but I do not believe that he was a Hall of Famer. He's in the Hall of Fame, but I just did not see a Hall of Fame caliber player. I think some of the reason why he's in the Hall of Fame is due to recency bias, the fact that he was on 2 championship teams with the Miami Heat, and the fact that I think that he was well liked by much of the media corps. Much of the media corps loved Chris Bosh, outside of Skip Bayless, I guess. So that, I mean, look, that's just my feelings. Yao Ming's NBA career was not Hall of Fame worthy, in my opinion, but when you combine it with his Chinese basketball career in the Chinese league, then it is Hall of Fame worthy. That's why I see him more as an international Hall of Famer. But anyway, I could see him being a Hall of Fame. I look at it like this with those two, right? And I really, unlike most videos, I really don't have the time to do like a stat by stat breakdown and stuff like that. But I'm just going to give you a general summary of how I feel about these two. I tend to look at Chris Bosh as having a better career, obviously because of the fact he played a little bit longer than Yao Ming and he had 2 NBA championships. But I think that Yao Ming was the more dominant and better player. Obviously, Yao Ming was bigger. He was stronger. He wasn't faster. Chris Bosh was more athletic. You could make the argument. Well, some people would argue that Chris Bosh was more skilled. In many ways, but I push back on that a bit because Yao Ming played in a somewhat different era. I mean, to me, 2010 was not that long ago, obviously, but Yao Ming played in the era where the center position was still, they were still centers. Okay. And, when Yao Ming retired, the center position was just starting to evolve into what we see today, where a lot of these guys are really just glorified stretch fours. Yao Ming to me was the better post defender. He was definitely a better shot blocker. They both, to me, were somewhat subpar rebounders. Chris Bosh averaged 8.5 rebounds for his career. Yao Ming, I think it was around 9.2 or something like that. Well, they both were subpar rebounders, but you gotta remember, Yao was like 7'5", 7'5", I think, barefoot. So, most players I've noticed that were centers or power forwards, I've noticed that the players who were over 7'2" tended to be less efficient and less dominant rebounders. When you look at it from a statistical standpoint, the tallest, to give you a point of reference, the tallest rebounding champions of all times were Kareem Abdul-Jabbar and Dikembe Mutombo. You know what I'm saying? Like Kareem was listed at 7'2", But actually in shoes, Kareem was 7'3". Especially, I think in his mid 30s after he was doing yoga, his height went from I think Kareem went from 7'1" and 7/8 to 7'2" and 1/4, something like that. But anyway, he was actually a sliver over 7'2". Anyway, those were the two tallest rebounding champions. And it seemed like over that, they became less efficient rebounds. The only rebounds they tended to get were the ones that came to them because of their height. I mean, when you look at it, a lot of rebounding champions were under 6'10". Charles Barkley, Dennis Rodman, Bob Pettit, Elvin Hayes, Wes Unseld, the list goes on and on. But anyway, Yao Ming was a better shot blocker. Yao Ming, to me, was a better mid-range shooter. But Chris Bosh, towards the end of his career, became a better three-point shooter. But that wasn't the balance of his career. That was towards the end. You could argue towards the end of his prime, I guess. And let's be honest, Chris Bosh infamously struggled for much of his tenure with the Miami Heat. He struggled, and he struggled oftentimes in the postseason, except for some games he played well. But I remember vividly him struggling. And I think a lot of times what happens is that over the years, people tend to remember the winning time. They tend to remember the games where he played well. But I definitely remember Chris Bosh struggling, especially when he began to lose weight to be able to play better, to better play on the perimeter. When he lost weight, his perimeter play improved, but his rebounding, positional, getting in position to box out and, things like that, he struggled. He struggled. Posting up, he struggled. But to me, man, it's honestly, I don't see either of these guys as for the hype that Yao Ming got, he was good. But to me, he wasn't the dominating player that many of people anticipated. His best years were something like 23 points per game, 9 rebounds, 2 blocks. Those are great numbers. But he was certainly, no Elvin Hayes. He was more efficient than Elvin Hayes. But he was certainly no Elvin Hayes from a production standpoint. Elvin Hayes in his prime was giving you 22, 23, 25 points a game, 12 rebounds, 2 blocks. From a facilitating standpoint, by default, you give it to Chris Bosh. None of these guys were ever first team anything, I believe. Which, to me, that's why I don't see Chris Bosh as a Hall of Famer. But he's in there, so he's a Hall of Famer per se. But a lot of these guys are in the Hall of Fame, and I just don't see why they are. So, I don't know what to say, man. Yao Ming played much of his prime with Trace McGrady with the Houston Rockets. The head coach for much of that tenure, if I remember correctly, was Jeff Van Gundy. They didn't really have much playoff success. That's why I kind of say, early on, Chris Bosh put up numbers with the Toronto Raptors, but he didn't have a good team around him, nor did they have really great coaching. He took them to playoffs a couple times, but they really weren't very successful. Then, like I said, when he went to Miami, he had to alter his role to play with LeBron James. But often, like the third wheels on a LeBron James team, he struggled. I don't know what else to say. I guess Yao Ming like I said, Yao Ming was the more dominant player, being 7'5", being 290 to 310 pounds, being at his time a shooter at a certain position that had range that you rarely saw. I think Yao only made 2 or 3 3-pointers in his career, but the fact that he could shoot out, if you remember correctly, he had range out to about 21, 22 feet, which at the time was range that you rarely saw in a big man. Remember, Pat Ewing and Robinson were shooting out to 17, 18 feet, sometimes 19 feet. So for Yao to be shooting out at 22 feet at the time, that was a very impressive. Now, of course, you got guys who are big men shooting from half court. But all around, I give the edge to Yao Ming. Scoring, post play, efficiency. Yao tended to be more consistent. When he was healthy, he was the better player. That's kind of how I look at it. He was the better player. But anyway, tell me what you guys think.